Hey there, welcome to the Reinsurance Podcast, the place where we dive into all things reinsurance, the coolest part of insurance. We're your hosts, Jared and Ben, a couple of ex-practitioners who loved the industry so much we founded Supercede to tackle some of its biggest headaches. And we're here to share our insights and stories with expert guests as we uncover what's really going on in the industry.
Hello everybody, delighted to have a special guest with us today. It's Silvi Wompa, the CEO of Munich Re's Specialty Group Europe. Welcome, Silvi. How are you?
Thanks very much, Ben. Pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, we're excited to have you.
Yeah, we have Jared here too.
I'm always here. No, but super excited to have you on the show. When we bring on guests, we love to first start with diving into how you landed in this one weird and wonderful world of reinsurance.
That's a good question, Jared. I started out my working life as a strategy consultant and thought it was the best job ever for about a week. And then I spent a number of years sleeping in an office bathroom. And at one point I thought there must be more to life than this. And I knew I liked numbers and I knew I liked international travel. I knew I didn't want to do banking, and somebody said, have you ever thought of insurance? Yeah. And of course I hadn't, but that's 25 years ago now, and here I am.
Yeah, very, very cool.
Oh, amazing. And from what I understand, you've done pretty much the full spectrum of insurance along the way, bits of life and health, bits of non-life, reinsurance as well, of course, more recently.
Yeah.
And, any favorites? You don't have to say reinsurance just because you're on the reinsurance podcast. But.
No, you know what I have truly appreciated is the mix of it all. I've always loved that eagle eye perspective and kind of understanding as much as I can of the value chain. But reinsurance does hold a very special place in my heart, I promise.
Yeah. Well, we wanted to dive a bit into the role that you have now and some of the special projects you guys are working on. And you look at sort of over those past 20 years, a number of innovations and things that have changed in the industry. But some of the work you guys are doing around telematics and geospatial stuff, what are some of the projects that you guys have on the move now? And what are the things that stand out to you with where we're taking some of this with technology?
If I start out just by looking at the industry as a whole, clearly there is a lot going on. A few of the things that continue to catch my eye are, so just mentioning a couple of examples. I think parametric insurance is one of these movements that I think truly can change how insurance is done, kind of moving from the indemnity model to a parametric model. That's one thing. A second one, which I think is moving things in a new direction, is what I would call algorithmic underwriting. So moving the insurance or the reinsurance industry closer to what you can see today in asset management. So rather than doing the single risk only type of setup, you actually and truly write across a whole portfolio. If you look around sort of the underwriting space, looking at, for instance, how you triage submissions, which is very basic in a way. It's looking at basic information, but turning that into something that is automated based on rules, I think is so cool. I think, also what you guys at Supercede are doing as well with sort of removing the email ping pong out of trading insurance. So many other places, have markets, right? Stock markets or marketplaces to create that in insurance as well. So I think there are so many different projects or movements out there that are changing the industry for the better. And of course, at Munich Re, I think we are looking at all of them, utilizing them in various ways. I think one thing that is very close to our hearts is how do we make the core of insurance and reinsurance, which is underwriting, better. How can we automate it? How can we take in more data to make the risk assessment better? How do we simplify the process to allow the human brain to focus on the things that truly matter?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I wondered, so we've got lots of listeners on the show who might not be familiar with all of the things we've talked about there. So Could you perhaps help us understand better what you mean by moving from indemnity to parametric? I guess what is that meaning, and why is it useful? Any obvious areas where it makes more sense than the traditional indemnity approach?
Absolutely. So, okay, let me give you a very simple example. So if we take your last travel when you went somewhere for holiday, and let's assume it might be the case that you were delayed. So if you have travel insurance, if you have a traditional indemnity-based policy, what would happen is you are delayed. Whenever you come back home or when you arrive at your hotel, you call your insurer, say, I was delayed by so and so much, and you have to sort of dig out the flight times, and then you have to submit that, and then you have to submit your receipts if you had to buy yourself an extra toothbrush or pair of trousers or whatever has gone missing. In the parametric world, there is literally somebody tracking how much your flight was delayed by. And if you meet the criterion, say that it needs to be delayed by an hour, and that's sort of tracked behind the scenes. So if the indicator says, this flight was delayed for more than 1 hour, the payment will be made automatically to you, a certain pre-specified amount, and then you can use it for whatever you want, and you don't have to spend the cash out of pocket.
Oh, amazing.
Well, and it sounds like it's a really critical thing of like improving the value proposition we're giving to the end consumer and increasing the desire and the demand for the product to exist in the market in many ways. So helping improve that experience is super central to this sort of ambition, it sounds like.
Yeah, and I think travel insurance is probably the simple end of the spectrum, probably another first world problem when you get to go on a holiday trip. I think where this really plays a role is also in catastrophic insurance, for instance, also for developing countries where we know very often that there is a large protection gap that traditional indemnity-based covers struggle to respond to well. And parametric insurance has been seen to make a difference there. So in this bigger theme of beginning to close the insurance or the cover gap, it can definitely play a role.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like that's in many ways related to the work around algorithmic trading, is if we can reduce the cost of the product, it allows us to sell that to a consumer base more effectively. If you can improve the way you deliver claims on a parametric basis, you're pulling out costs along the way. Do you feel that Munich Re, because of its size, has a role in helping sort of close the protection gap or sort of increase the market size of the industry?
So usually when you are big, I guess you stand more in the limelight, and you do have a responsibility for sure. I think that responsibility is shared by everybody in the industry, large and small, carrier and broker and so on and so forth. But I think Munich Re takes a lot of pride in the work that we can do, also because of the resources that we have at our disposal, because we know we are fortunate, right? Not every company has that kind of insight or expertise or network across the globe, or size of balance sheet for that matter, to absorb shocks.
Yeah.
And I guess across the great gamut of Munich Re's activities, pushing the frontier or expanding the frontier, whichever it may be, are there any projects in particular that stand out for you over the past few years in that context that you want to celebrate or draw attention to?
So I'd like to mention two, perhaps. I think the parametric side is one thing that we have invested a lot of sort of insight into, and making that move properly across the market. So that's one area. I think the cyberspace, I don't think you can do a podcast like this without talking about cyber at some point. Cyber is an area that we have taken a long time interest in, and clearly it's a very fast moving one. But I think the fact that we have been consistent in our interest as a reinsurer and as an insurer, I'm particularly proud that we can, help the wider economy respond to those shocks.
Yeah.
Nice. And we wanted to actually talk about leadership a bit here. Obviously, Munich Re being a leader in many of the spaces we've just talked about, but actually also personal leadership, because we benefit from having many listeners on this show who aspire one day to become leaders themselves. And as luck would have it, we have a leader with us on the show today. So would love to hear your thoughts on, the journey to becoming a leader in our space, what it means, any tips you'd want to share with aspiring leaders out there.
Yeah. With hindsight, you would think, oh, it's so simple. And then when you're in the midst of it, you're like, oh my God, this is such a storm. But having done it for a while, yeah, you do gather a few things. And I saw not that long ago a little video clip with Barack Obama, and I think he was interviewed about kind of what would he say to young people who are aspiring. And I think he said something like, get the basics right, show up neat and clean, show that you work hard and get things done. I think that's the very, very first thing that I think goes for anyone, right, who has an ambition. I think after that, it's about, putting yourself up for stretch projects, for doing more, for showing interest, but not keeping that a secret. I think it's also important to not just show up for that, but also then tell the world about the things you do. At least as a girl, I was often told, you just put your head down and you work hard, and that's good too, but you also need to tell people the good stuff that you do and make it known. And that leads me to my third thing, which is network. You have to network, because at least in my life, I would say the most fun and exhilarating opportunities have come from left of center, not through the applications I have made, but rather through the people I have known. And usually it's been completely unexpected, the best things that have come around, basically. And then a lot of young people ask me about, people management and look upon that as a sort of holy grail. And I always try to say, well, yes, people leadership is very, very important if you want to grow and become more senior. But maybe the bulk standard 1A version of people management, which is to become a line manager, isn't always readily available because of how the company is set up or general hierarchies. And I always say, well, what other leadership opportunities can you explore? Can you take on a project and lead people in a project? Can you mentor people? Can you pay it forward with your own experience? And just kind of know that every experience counts. It doesn't have to be just the bulk standard line management role that shows you how to be a good people leader. And then lastly, what I still tell myself is what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, at least over time. And I think, it's hard to grow without going through difficulties and without being outside of your own comfort zone. And that can be very, very tough. But to remember that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, can carry you very, very far.
Yeah, I think it's super important to have people focus on knowing what you're doing for the early part of your career. I think a lot of very young people in the industry are incredibly ambitious, and that's great, but want to jump ahead, and it takes time to sort of learn the basics and become sort of very knowledgeable. But as you say, look for opportunities, whether that's a new role or a new company or a new project or something that opens up doors for you. Because you've sort of lived and worked around the industry and around the world, have you found the networking piece easier or harder in certain areas? I know London is sort of everyone's in this little square quarter mile almost, which makes it very easy to pop by and see people. But have you seen other markets that are they equally as easy, or are they difficult because of they're a bit more spread out?
I guess geography and culture plays a part in that. I think London is amazing in that respect. So is New York. I think any melting pot of that size has it just takes the prize, right? Then it's a question of do you in your culture have a networking component, and some countries have it more, others have it less. And of course, like here where you have the square mile, well, as you say, it's so easy. Of course, there's just more of it. I think in other places you have to make a little bit more of an effort, which isn't bad either. I think you sort of, you just probably use your time in a different way. But yeah, for me, London is priceless from a networking point of view.
Yeah.
And I guess setting an example to other would-be future leaders, I did read somewhere that you speak 8 languages. Is that correct? Or at least a very large number of languages. Do you think language skills are an important skill for young executives to nurture as they look ahead?
I usually say I cheat in 8 languages, but yes, I guess that's the consequence of growing up in a small place very far up north.
It's very, very impressive. I mean, I think that's more than double what we've got between us,
exactly.
I would guess.
Multiplied even, it still probably beats us.
Look, I think I think we're all different, right? I think for me, it has definitely made a difference. Of course, language in itself is one thing, but language opens doors, even if you speak it badly. Because if you show people that you make an effort, even if it's a really bad one, there may be doors opening for you that wouldn't open to somebody who just assumed that English was the lingua franca or something else, right? And through that cultural awareness, I think also comes the knowledge that one size doesn't fit all. And I think you become, or at least I certainly have over time, become less afraid of maybe adapting and saying, look, it's okay. It's just how it needs to be. Life finds a way. But it's also very useful for doing business because if you can find a way of getting under the skin through language or cultural knowledge, you can also be shown opportunities that wouldn't necessarily pass under the nose of somebody who just assumed that,
And do you think, I guess, talking about different regions there and different cultures and languages and so on, are there any regions that you think are especially well poised to move towards innovation in ways that perhaps others are less inclined? Are there particular pots that you think something exciting is happening in that region or elsewhere?
Well, I guess the first question is how do you define a region? Because, but if we generalize a little bit and look at the big regions of the world, one region that I'm personally very excited about is Asia. And why am I saying that? I think it's because, of course, there are very developed parts of Asia. There are also still many developing parts of Asia, but I think that's where we see probably the fastest growth in income per capita and therefore insurance needs, right? And with that comes whole new marketplaces. It's also a very big agricultural part of the world where, again, coming back to the parametric topic, a lot of security is needed, which has never existed before. And so I find that one very, very interesting from that angle. I think the US will probably remain very strong on innovation because of the access to venture capital. I think the US is unparalleled, at least has been to date, and probably will remain so for a good while longer because of the regulations you have there. But let's not forget about Europe and specifically the UK. I think I read a report only this morning saying that the UK has the most insurtech employees per capita in the whole world, which I find like, whoa, that's so cool, right? And of course, there's not an equal sign between insurtech and innovation, but there's probably some kind of relation. So from that angle, I think London still holds a very strong position.
Yeah. When you look at both the opportunities that you see from startups going into new markets and tackling new products and similar, but also regions, as you sort of outlined in Asia, where do you see like the largest opportunities for growth as like an insurance market, but also like the challenges that sort of sit alongside those opportunities?
Do you mean regionally or more the market, like the products?
The market more broadly as a whole, but it might be an extension of regional. It might be the challenges around us growing the agriculture penetration rate or similar that's supported by governments currently, or it could be, how we close protection gaps, and where technology fits there. But sort of market wide, the opportunities that you see are most sort of obvious, but then the challenges that sort of sit next to those.
Sure. So for me, I guess there are two big themes. One, if we look at what you might still call the developing world, and if I look at a country, for instance, like India, which plays a large part, in the Asian region, clearly very strong growth, very large population. Lots of agribusiness, but also a lot of other types of business in industry almost across the board. I find that very, very interesting also to see kind of, will we see the sort of phenomenons that we saw, for instance, in Africa with banking, where you literally jump several development steps, right? There was no online banking in a computer, you move directly to mobile banking. And I'm really interested to see, will we have those opportunities, for instance, in a place like India, because it's so vast, there's much to do, and there are several different areas that you can play in. Another area that I find interesting from a risk perspective or market perspective is these more, let's call them esoteric risks. So if you read the World Economic Forum's annual risk report, it's published every year in conjunction with Davos, and to see kind of what risks are pointed out there. Of course, lately I think war has come up very high on that agenda. Climate risk is another, but one that has featured consistently for a long time is things like intellectual property or share price risk, things that are more systemic, which still I think the insurance industry is beginning to understand how that can be covered, if at all. And usually the key to understanding a risk is data. And having tech that helps you get that data in a better way at a larger scale. And I think those aspects, right, where today we say we don't really have much of a solution because we don't know how to find the underlying information, I think that's where you can truly make a difference.
Yeah, getting that data into a form in which like we are able to understand what it tells us about risk is paramount to hitting any of these sort of things.
And pricing it accordingly.
Yeah.
Because it's the pricing that at the end of the day is the big crux.
Yeah, no, sure.
Yeah, no, certainly. And I think it was interesting reading a few pieces from different industry leaders at the moment as to where we will see an intersection between some of the risks typically held by governments in particular and private institutions, and where they're comfortable blending in the middle, I guess, or not at all. I think you mentioned systemic risks and how willing private insurers are to take on a risk that's deemed systemic, or whether a sort of sharing can be agreed and with the right terms.
Yeah. Or even trading places. I mean, I think we also see phenomena where risks that traditionally have been assumed by governments, not everywhere, but very often catastrophic risk is actually being pushed to the private market as climate change has sort of increased in strength.
Yeah, you see that sort of private government partnership model being very, very important to a number of areas in the sort of insurance ecosystem. In many places to help cover the protection gap where it's sort of critical that we have protection for like the end consumers. If the private markets don't come in entirely on their own to do it, the government has to step in and have some sort of supportive role to play there.
Yeah.
I would be remiss not to ask you, as also a person well experienced in the technology side of the insurance industry, what do you make of all of the latest AI excitement and trends going on in our space? And I should mention, of course, that you are not just a ex-consultant and insurance, reinsurance expert, but also a startup founder and AI related startup founder to some extent as well. So would love to get your some context on that and your understanding of where we are with the AI opportunity.
Yeah,
let's call it that.
I'm glad you did end it with the AI.
Do you always ask questions these big?
Yeah. I try to go right into them.
Plenty of scope to take it in any direction that you want.
Look, I mean, there are so many aspects to this, but let me share a few thoughts, right? I think there is a lot of value that can come out of it, and it being the AI. If we look first of all at the sort of the administrative side of insurance, having a machine alongside the human eye to, for instance, look for errors or look for similarities and so on. A human brain tires, a machine never does, right? So I think that is immensely valuable, especially in an industry which hasn't, prided itself on that kind of development before. So I think using it for policy administration or claims or cash settlement, and to free up human brains for the things that really matter, I think is tremendously valuable. Alongside that, as we just talked about, finding the data that actually would help us judge risk and price risk better, for me is the holy grail in this as an old underwriter. Yeah. That's where I think it can really come into play. Now, sort of having talked about it in an optimistic way, I just also think we need to be really careful because I think that we already start getting examples, right, of where AI goes wrong. Yep. It had nothing to do with insurance, but there was this example of a lawyer, I believe, in the US who had asked ChatGPT to basically come up with a summary of a certain case, and didn't understand that it wasn't really Google. This was actually something building on patterns that they saw, right? And I think something, I presume this individual was actually disbarred, right? And which kind of shows that I think we also need to exercise a lot of judgment and a lot of care before we say, okay, hands off, this can run entirely by itself. But look, I think we have time on our side because I believe this will get better and better and better. Yeah. And as long as we exercise judgment in what we apply AI to, I think we can only win over time, honestly. Yeah,
and when you think about it, when you think about the role in data, especially in our industry, data has to be 100% accurate 100% of the time. And where AI currently sits, that is not always the outcome, as you pointed out, and that role is super important. But it's interesting as well when you talk about algorithmic underwriting and these other things and understanding risk better, you can see the parallels that the financial markets kind of had where sort of before AI was a thing as such, but they were able to track like correlation across various categories and things across the world to say, okay, these things tend to happen. Then following that, these other things tend to shift. So they began to be able to understand portfolio risk better. I think as an industry, we could start doing those things a bit better, right? As you look at some of those esoteric risks that you outlined before, yes, we have the basics of did the wind blow, did the earth shake kind of basics. Yeah. But when you get into more nuanced risk and cyber-related risk and similar, it's like, ooh, these things are happening here. And we've seen historically, because we're pulling in more data and we're able to leverage that data to understand risk, it gives us an idea of what we think might be happening somewhere else and preventative measures being introduced or similar. So it begins to evolve the way we can understand and interpret risk, which will benefit the market.
I mean, just think of COVID, right? I don't think anyone before COVID happened could have imagined that a pandemic, which would unleash one certain type of cover in the insurance world, would give rise to so many business interruption claims. And I think that's a whole new data point that will probably inform, many more generations to come, which is super cool.
Yeah.
And are you ready for another big open-ended question?
Give it to me, of course.
I understand another part of your past life is an economist background as well, having studied economics. But across that broad spectrum of themes, including recent recovery from a pandemic, hopefully the last one for a long time, also the geopolitical landscape that we mentioned, climate change that you mentioned earlier on. What do you think are the themes most relevant for the insurance and reinsurance industry to be thinking about right now? Because it feels like there's almost too much to think about. So if you were to zoom in and say, well, try and just keep track of this one, maybe, what would you draw attention to in particular?
Another big question. Thank you, Ben. No, I love it. Look, I think we've mentioned a few of them already, and I think they are worth mentioning again. I think climate change undoubtedly has to be on that list because it affects so many people, so many companies, so many governments across the world in ways that some of it, yes, I think we've always imagined, but I think in whole new ways as well, with floodings in Dubai and German landslides from floods and so on. So I think that's certainly one. We've also talked about data and tech. I think for me, a real question for the future is how does this industry truly get data and technology into its value chain throughout, not just in bits and pieces, but truly throughout. A third one is, which for me is absolutely critical, so given the data and tech angle, is how do we get talent and new kinds of talent into the insurance industry? Again, I read somewhere that the average age of an insurance employee, I think in the UK, is 45. It might be even globally, and it hasn't changed. And that for me is concerning. And not just a certain sort of employees, but also how do we get the best programmers, data scientists into that industry. So that's the third one. And let me just see, what else did I think of? Yeah, look, closing the insurance gap, which we've also mentioned. Yes, I think the climate change angle there is a given, but as we talked about, these more esoteric risks that occupy the minds of so many business leaders, so many human beings, but that as an industry we don't respond to today, and to maintain our relevance, I think that's critical to address as well.
Yeah, in many ways, it's attracting the individuals who see insurance as like a mission-driven industry. Like, we have this opportunity to close protection gaps. We have this opportunity to like fundamentally improve the lives of people around the world, but like we need the sort of data and tech to be able to do that. But finding a way to articulate that value proposition to that generation in a way that like they look at an opportunity to have an impact on the world, and seeing our space as like a fundamentally important one to come into. Right? It's like, how do you get people who are in their late teens and early 20s now to go, that's where I want to go?
Yeah.
Because even you were saying, and you won't be surprised, most of the guests on this show, like at some point landed in insurance, just like, it's like, and it wasn't the, someone brings up, oh, how about insurance? And you go, oh, I could do that, and hadn't considered it up until now. Like, how do we get in front of that a bit more, which I think will be a really interesting part of this developing young talent journey that I think the industry is on.
Yeah, I mean, I also believe that you mentioned the collaboration between the private sector and governments. I think that role might, play a part in that as well, because I think that some of these risks that are hard to cover will need a certain government involvement for a while until there is enough data to be able to cover it properly in the private sector. And I would hope that through that, you can also then show younger people, right, that there is a good amount of good stuff to be done here.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I remember reading as well, talking of multiculturalism as well, that Generation Z or Z, or I don't know if there's any other pronunciations of the final letter in that alphabet, actually proportionally something like 4/5 of all Gen Zers or Zers are based in emerging economies today. You've got massive, fast-growing countries. India we talked about, but also Nigeria, where I think the average age across a 200 and something million population is about 18 or something. So you've got these huge potential talent pools that might not have the same historic links to the insurance industry like we found, in London, where it's almost not surprising to me that you mentioned we've got, the most insurtech employees per capita, well, because there's so many insurance nerds here who are really excited about what the industry has done. How do we get these emerging talent pools, to also be excited about insurance? So.
I'm wondering if embedded insurance has a role to play there, because it's one thing when you say, oh, it's insurance like a box on its own, and of course, to a certain extent, it needs to be because there are big complex risks and so on. But I think risk transfer can form such a natural part of so many service or product offerings in this world that it can become quite a natural, interesting add-on as opposed to a sort of behemoth in its own right. And I hope that could be a path to attract different types of talent.
Hopefully, as an industry, we're developing a menu from what you've discussed today. Or
people
or
are taking notes ferociously as they go.
Insurance companies of the future, they're going to need all these tools: the data, the AI, the algorithmic underwriting, parametric triggers, relationships, languages, networks. I think we've covered a sort of manifesto today of what is required.
An absolute delight, and I'd expect nothing less, Silvi. It was an absolutely delightful conversation. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for the big open-ended questions.
You're welcome.
A lot of fun. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for tuning in to the Reinsurance Podcast. If you enjoyed our show, don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review to let us know how we're doing, preferably 5 stars. For more insights and updates, follow us on LinkedIn.